This is Pakistan, an economy at the very centre of 21st century geopolitics. One so invested in China's Belt and Road Initiative, it's been labelled a flagship country. Yet also one which has claimed no less than 22 loans from the IMF over the years, balancing a rapidly growing population against a series of economic challenges. In the first few decades of its existence, it was viewed as a model of planned economic development, whose economic planning strategy was copied by the likes of South Korea. Fast forwarding a few decades, and South Korea's GDP per capita is around 30 times that of Pakistan's. In contrast to the export-savvy Asian tiger, the country imports almost twice what it exports, which for any economy is a symptom of underlying challenges as much as a direct cause. But over the last few years, the nation has come up with an ambitious plan to help change its economic fortunes. One which has been developed very much in sync with China's Belt and Road Initiative, through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, a $60 billion plan to build railways, roads and ports all the way from the Chinese border down to the Arabian Sea, giving China access to the Indian Ocean. In the process, the corridor has become the global flagship for the Belt and Road. Yet, despite impressive megaprojects, Pakistan's growth is not accelerating as fast as originally planned. One of the key reasons being the country's debt pile. And here again, China stands out, owning over a quarter of Pakistan's external debt. Not to mention that the nation's overall debt has nearly doubled in the last 5 years, leading to fears over whether it has fallen into the infamous debt trap. Raising a few important questions. How did Pakistan get here? Is Pakistan in a debt trap? Why may it be overly reliant on China? And what options does Pakistan have in addressing its economic challenges? So, with that in mind, how did Pakistan get here? A good place to start is when the British Empire left in 1947. Following partition with India, Pakistan was largely an agriculture-based economy, with just over half of its economic output reliant on agriculture, and 2/3 of its workforce. Faced with a small private sector, relying on a centralised authority didn't seem like such a bad idea at the time, as Soviet-inspired 5-year plans were heavily relied upon to help industrialise the nation. Beyond just the headline, the key to these central plans, at least when it came to industry, was pursuing a policy of import substitution. A common strategy at the time, and one we've highlighted in the past for economies like Mexico. Another interesting country that you can learn all about by following the link which should be appearing on your screen. Now, as for this video, the substitution of imports for domestic production was just part of the strategy. Deep-rooted reforms of agriculture were also essential, given that such a large segment of the population were entirely dependent on what they could grow. These reforms were the backbone of Pakistan's so-called golden era of the early 60s, alongside foreign aid and political stability that helped the country implement a number of fundamental changes, such as a series of massive irrigation projects, farmyard mechanisation, educational reform, and the development of a textile industry. However, the bad news was that this golden period was fairly short-lived. The country experienced several destabilising events. Wars with India and rising inequality played a big role in Bangladesh's departure in the early 70s, creating large economic losses which were a big factor in the series of IMF bailouts that quickly followed. Following this, the economy moved towards nationalisation in the 70s, with most major industries falling into public ownership. And just like in so many other countries, once private ownership came under threat, capital flight quickly followed, as did further bailouts. By the 1980s, the harsh impacts of nationalisation had led to another change in strategy, as private enterprise started to look like a good idea, in large part due to things like deregulation and significant amounts of US aid following the Soviet invasion of neighbouring Afghanistan. But a general economic change didn't stop yet more bailouts. Notably, the 80s also saw the level of remittances, being the money sent home from abroad, start to play a big role in the economy, peaking at 10% of GDP. And this trend didn't escape the notice of the government, being relied upon to help finance its budget deficit. Unfortunately, as remittances declined in the 90s, Pakistan entered a lost decade, as both rising instability and inconsistent public policies undermined public confidence, with yet further rounds of IMF bailouts. Crucially, 1998 saw the country force its way into the club of nuclear powers, something which didn't go down too well with the other members, resulting in sanctions for an already weak economy. As the Economist's intelligence unit reported, on the eve of Pakistan's nuclear test, the economy was already only limping along, helping to explain why its debt to GDP reached its peak in the years after this. However, in more recent years, this debt has begun to increase as well, raising an important point. Given its cycle of debt crises and loans, is Pakistan in a debt trap? Before we answer this, it's important to know what a debt trap actually is. At the individual level, this can be defined as a situation in which a debt is difficult or impossible to repay, typically because high interest payments prevent repayment of the principal, just like having to shuffle credit cards to decide which one to pay using another, but never really getting on top of things. So when you scale this up to the realms of a whole country, this presents a whole new level of challenges. Over the decades, the nation's response to its debt crisis has been to continuously obtain loans from the IMF. No surprises then that it is one of the largest borrowers from the lender of last resort, alongside the likes of Argentina, Egypt and Ukraine. Fun fact: borrowing from the IMF no less than 22 times, and then some from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank and Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia. With this in mind and its general struggles in raising enough revenue to service its loans, its borrowings have inevitably been passed down the generations. And that, for Pakistan, underlines the increasing importance of its network of regional alliances, with countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and of course China, who we'll be talking about shortly. To add to this, since 2008, Pakistan has frequently featured in the Financial Action Task Force Grey List, which is a list of nations presenting a significant risk of money laundering and terror financing, but which have committed to address these, though just being on the list is a huge headache. Reports estimate that the listing has cost the economy $38 billion in lost opportunities over the years, as international investors shy away and economic activity slows down, with $10 billion of that missed wealth coming since its most recent listing in 2018. To help put that into perspective, the country's GDP was $263 billion in 2020. Fundamentally, we're talking about economic activity that could go a long way to addressing the nation's debt issues. The national debt amounts to a staggering 88% of GDP, which is far higher than the 50% target set by Parliament. However, this debt is set to continue rising to $325 billion in the next 5 years, way above the 40% debt to GDP level the IMF suggests is sustainable. In fairness though, Pakistan is far from alone in breaking the sustainable debt level. Before COVID, only 54 countries worldwide had managed to maintain a ratio below 40%. And speaking about debt, it's time to now introduce Pakistan's all-weather friend, China. A friendship identified by generations of leaders as stronger than steel, sweeter than honey, and deeper than oceans. Which sounds lovely. Though in economic terms, this relationship has focused around the development of Pakistan's infrastructure through considerable Chinese loans, and so raises a very important question. Why may Pakistan be overly reliant on China? A huge part of this has to do with China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI goes well beyond just one country, as a global infrastructure development strategy which China is constructing to link East Asia to Europe by road, rail and sea. And Pakistan is playing a huge role in this strategy, primarily through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, which we mentioned earlier. A collection of infrastructure and energy projects stretching from the Chinese border all the way down to the Arabian Sea, equating to $60 billion. For China, CPEC can be considered the flagship project of the Belt and Road, providing not only strategic access to the Arabian Sea, but also a viable alternative to the Strait of Malacca choke point. Its critics have often argued that the Belt and Road is an attempt by China to capture recipient countries with loans they can't repay and then take control of the indebted nation's infrastructure. Former US Vice President Mike Pence went one step further, calling the initiative debt trap diplomacy. Yet such terms have been criticized by quite a few American institutions and think tanks, arguing that Chinese lenders will often seek to renegotiate, restructure, or refinance loans in the first place. Now, going back to the story at hand, all this focus on Pakistan's involvement in the Belt and Road is part of a wider point: the country's difficulties in raising foreign direct investment. In 2020, FDI amounted to $2.5 billion, less than 1% of GDP, a far cry of the 3.5% heydays of 2007 and 8. This weakness when it comes to foreign direct investment hasn't gone unnoticed, improving its ease of doing business ranking by 39 points in just 2 years. An unprecedented improvement, with most of the gains coming from the starting a business metric which feeds into the overall score. Yet, for all of the investment, critics have argued the country is squandering a golden economic opportunity. Projects once held for their promise to bring employment and wealth have instead been built by Chinese labour, equipment and materials. For example, reports indicate that after so many years and billions invested, only about 75,000 jobs linked to CPEC have been created in Pakistan, far short of the 1.5 million jobs per year originally promised, making any game changers show few signs of the game actually being changed. We can't help but think, what options does Pakistan have to address its economic challenges? Any solution is likely to incorporate Pakistan's rapidly growing population. At an average age of just 22, the nation benefits from a massive demographic dividend, though this dividend is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, a growing labour force can boost output and consumption, lifting economic growth. On the other hand, high unemployment, low wages and a large informal sector so often plague rapidly growing populations. In fairness, the country does benefit from the impressive growth of its middle class, anticipated to grow from 63 million in 2015 to over 120 million by 2025. To put that in context, only China and India are expected to experience a larger gain over the period. Moving from the who to the where, Pakistan's growing middle class is set to focus on its fast emerging urban areas. The country has the highest rate of urbanization in South Asia, with the UN estimating that by 2025, nearly half of the country's inhabitants will be living in cities, a key milestone for any economy. Another such milestone will be improving the nation's economic perception, particularly when it comes to indices like economic freedom, a term which encompasses a number of factors like the rule of law, government efficiency, and how open markets are in general. Unfortunately, it ranks 152nd on the index, and 34th among the 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Sadly, this relatively poor performance is part of a wider trend, as it ranks 124th for corruption, highlighting the importance of improving institutional reform if it is to prosper in the future. Next up, and perhaps the most crucial, is debt restructuring. Currently, the country spends around 1/3 of its total federal budget on paying the interest on its debts, money it could be using to invest in its economic development. If a successful restructuring plan can be achieved, this may just give its ailing economy the breathing space needed for a fresh start, reducing debt dependency in the coming years. On the plus side, one of Pakistan's greatest strengths has been its foreign remittances, particularly from those working in the Middle East, increasing from just over 3 to 10% of GDP in the last 15 years, driven by increased worker migration, higher skilled migrants, and cracking down on illegal transfers, all of which have provided a vital source of foreign currency. However, this is also reflective of a brain drain, as skilled workers seek opportunities abroad. The challenge, therefore, will be how to attract these citizens back. It's near impossible to discuss Pakistan's economy without reference to its position on the map, a point underpinning so many of the infrastructure projects that form the basis of the country's plans. Yet, we can't help but feel that the Belt and Road is just one piece of the economic jigsaw. There are so many other pieces of the economic puzzle which need to fall into place first, especially if the country is to fully reap the benefits of its infrastructure, as well as avoiding the concerns raised over its debts. Chief amongst these will be deep structural reforms, in the shape of improved competitiveness, efficiency and economic stability, particularly if the nation is to capitalise on its growing middle class and attract its international labour force home. As for China, well, whether its investment is a gamble or in which ways it pays off really depends on how Pakistan addresses its economic challenges. Now, we'd be interested to know your thoughts on the matter. Is Pakistan in a debt trap? Should it worry about being so reliant on one country for its critical infrastructure? What's the best way to overcome its challenges? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And as always, see you in the next one.